What if humanity was never meant to rule the earth alone? And what if the dragons that appear in every ancient culture were not mythological beasts, but the original custodians of a sacred covenant that bound heaven to earth, spirit to matter, the eternal to the temporal, until that covenant was broken by those who sought dominion rather than partnership? In the mountains of Tibet, where the air is thin enough that breathing becomes a form of meditation and the silence is so profound that monks claim to hear the thoughts of stars, there exists a monastery that appears on no map and accepts no visitors who have not been called by dreams that repeat across 7 consecutive nights. Within the innermost sanctuary of this monastery, guarded by monks who have taken vows of silence so complete that they communicate only through gestures refined over centuries into a language more precise than words, there rests a manuscript bound in scales that shimmer with colors no dye can produce, and it contains the testimony of the last dragon keeper, the final human who remembered the covenant before it was erased from collective memory and replaced with stories of heroes slaying monsters. In the spring of 2003, a linguist named Dr. James Chen received a grant to study the evolution of written language in remote Himalayan communities, and on the 7th night after arriving in the region, he had a dream that would change not just his research, but his entire understanding of human history and human potential. He saw himself climbing a path that did not exist on any of the maps he had studied, following stone markers carved with symbols that predated any known writing system, ascending toward a monastery that appeared and disappeared in the mountain mist, like a thought hovering at the edge of consciousness. At the monastery gate stood a figure whose face he could not see clearly, and this figure spoke to him in a voice that resonated not in his ears, but in his chest, in the very bones of his ribcage. "You have been called," the voice said, "because you carry in your lineage the memory of the covenant, even though your conscious mind has forgotten what your cells remember. The Dragon Keeper's manuscript has waited 700 years for one who could read it with understanding rather than fear, who could receive what it contains without immediately trying to control it or destroy it. The time of forgetting is ending. The time of remembering begins with those who can hear the call without needing to understand it first, who can follow the path even when reason declares it impossible." James woke from the dream with his heart pounding and the image of the stone markers vivid in his mind, so vivid that he could draw them from memory with a precision that surprised him. He showed the drawings to his local guide, an elderly man who had lived his entire life in these mountains, and the guide's face went pale with recognition and something that looked like fear. "These are the markers of the silent path," he said quietly. "I have heard of them from my grandfather's grandfather, but I thought they were only legend, stories told to teach children about the old ways before Buddhism came to these lands. If you have seen them in dream, then you must follow them. But know this, those who walk the silent path either return transformed or do not return at all." James spent 3 days preparing, gathering supplies and informing his colleagues that he would be conducting fieldwork in a remote area and would be unreachable for perhaps a week or more. And then, at dawn on the 4th day, he began to walk, following the map that existed not on paper, but in the dream memory that had been planted in his consciousness. He found the first marker exactly where the dream had shown it, a standing stone carved with the symbol of a dragon coiled around a spiral that seemed to draw the eye inward toward infinite depth. And he felt a jolt of recognition so strong it was almost physical, as though his body remembered this path even if his mind did not. The ascent took 2 full days, climbing higher than he had ever climbed before, passing through zones where vegetation gave way to bare rock, and bare rock gave way to snow and ice that gleamed in the thin sunlight like crystallized starlight. He saw no other travelers, encountered no villages or even shepherds' huts, and as the silence deepened around him, he began to understand why the monks who guarded the monastery had chosen muteness as their discipline. Speech seemed trivial in this landscape, inadequate to the vastness of stone and sky and the presence that he felt growing stronger with each step. A consciousness that was neither human nor divine, but something that existed in the space between, ancient and patient and utterly foreign to the categories his academic training had taught him to use. On the evening of the second day, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and crimson that seemed to set the mountain peaks themselves on fire, he saw the monastery emerging from the mist, exactly as the dream had shown it. The walls were built from stones so perfectly fitted that no mortar was needed, and the roof was covered with tiles that caught the dying light and reflected it back in patterns that shifted and changed like living things. At the gate stood the same figure from his dream, and though James could now see that it was an elderly monk whose face was weathered by decades of exposure to these brutal elements, there was still something about him that resisted clear perception, as though he existed partially in this world and partially in some other realm. The monk gestured for James to follow, and they moved through corridors lit by butter lamps that cast shadows deep enough to seem like openings into other dimensions. They passed meditation halls where monks sat in perfect stillness, their breathing so slow and subtle that James had to watch closely to be sure they were alive. They climbed stairs that spiraled upward through the heart of the monastery like the DNA helix that James had studied in biology courses a lifetime ago. And finally, they reached a door carved from a single piece of wood, so dark and dense it might have been petrified, and on that door was carved the same symbol James had seen on the first marker, the dragon coiled around the infinite spiral. The monk opened the door with a gesture that seemed more invocation than physical action, and James stepped into a chamber that took his breath away. The walls were covered with murals depicting scenes from a history he had never encountered in any academic text, images of humans and dragons working together to shape the landscape, to guide the weather, to maintain the balance between the wild forces of nature and the needs of conscious beings who required stability to build civilization. The dragons in these images were not the monsters of European legend, breathing fire and hoarding gold and terrorizing villages. They were teachers and guardians, beings of such refined consciousness that they could perceive the flows of energy that connected all things and could adjust those flows to prevent disasters, to ensure that the rains came when needed and the floods did not come when they would destroy. In the center of the chamber, resting on a stand carved from crystal that seemed to generate its own internal light, was the manuscript. James approached it slowly, his hands trembling, and when he opened the cover and saw the first page, he felt tears streaming down his face, though he could not have explained why. The text was written in a script he had never seen before, characters that combined pictographic and phonetic elements in ways that should not have been possible according to the linguistic models he had spent his career studying. And yet somehow, impossibly, he could read it. The knowledge flowed directly from the symbols into his consciousness, bypassing the usual process of decoding and translation, as though the manuscript itself was teaching him its language in the moment of reading. The text began with words that seemed to echo in the chamber long after his eyes had moved past them. I am the last of the Dragon Keepers, and I write this testimony in the year that the covenant was broken, when humanity chose dominion over partnership and the dragons withdrew from the manifest world rather than remain in a relationship built on betrayal. What I record here is not just history, but warning, not just memory, but prophecy, for I have seen in vision that the time will come when the imbalance created by our choice will threaten not just human civilization, but the earth herself, and in that time, those who can remember the covenant will be called to restore it, or witness the destruction of everything the dragons and their human partners built together over thousands of years of collaboration. Und the Dragon Keeper, whose name was rendered in characters that James understood, meant something like, "He who speaks with the Ancient Ones," described a world that existed before the patriarchal religions established their dominance. a time when the relationship between humans and dragons was governed by a covenant so sacred that breaking it was literally unthinkable to those who lived under its terms. The covenant was simple in its essence, but profound in its implications. The dragons, who were beings of pure consciousness that could take physical form when needed, but existed primarily in the energetic realms, agreed to share their knowledge with humanity, to teach the arts of weather working and earth healing, energy perception, and consciousness transformation. In exchange, humans agreed to serve as caretakers of the physical world, to maintain the balance between wilderness and cultivation, to ensure that their activities never damaged the web of life that sustained all beings. It was a sacred marriage, the text explained, between the wisdom of beings who had evolved beyond the need for dense physical form and the creative power of beings who were still deeply embedded in matter and who could therefore work with matter in ways that pure consciousness could not. Together, we accomplished what neither could accomplish alone. The dragons taught us to see the energy flows that connected all things, and we used that seeing to guide our agriculture, our architecture, our social structures. We built temples at the points where energy lines converged, creating amplification nodes that benefited not just humans, but all the creatures and plants in the surrounding region. We worked with the dragons to prevent earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, to guide storm systems away from vulnerable populations, to maintain the delicate balance that allowed diverse ecosystems to flourish. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any of our content. And tell us in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to know. James read descriptions of practices that sounded like fantasy, but that were presented with such matter-of-fact precision that he found himself suspending his academic skepticism and simply receiving what the text offered. Dragon keepers were trained from childhood in the arts of energy perception, learning to see the luminous webs that connected all living things, to feel the flows of chi or prana, or whatever name each culture gave to the life force that animated the physical world. They learned to communicate with dragons through a form of telepathy that transcended language, a direct mind-to-mind transmission that conveyed not just information, but entire gestalts of meaning, emotion, and intention compressed into single moments of contact. And they learned the most sacred practice of all, the one that the text called the Dragon Dance, a form of moving meditation that aligned human consciousness with dragon consciousness so completely that for brief periods the boundary between them dissolved and a temporary fusion occurred, creating a state of awareness that perceived simultaneously from the ground-level perspective of embodied humanity and the cosmic perspective of beings who could see the Earth as a single living organism and who understood the patterns that governed its evolution across geological timescales. But then, the manuscript described the breaking, the moment when everything changed. A faction of humans, led by priests who worshipped sky gods and solar deities, grew resentful of the partnership with dragons. They argued that humans should not need intermediaries to access divine power, that the dragons were keeping humanity in a state of dependence, that true spiritual advancement required transcending the earthly realm rather than maintaining balance within it. They declared that the body was a prison, that matter was inferior to spirit, that salvation came through ascending to heaven rather than consecrating the earth. They were wrong, the Dragon Keeper wrote with a force that James could feel even across the centuries, but their wrongness had a seductive power because it appealed to the ego's desire for supremacy, for the fantasy that humans could be like gods without needing the partnership and the discipline that the covenant required. They taught that dragons were actually demons, fallen angels who had been cast out of heaven and who sought to trap human souls in matter. They rewrote our sacred histories, transforming the teachers into monsters, the guardians into threats, the covenant partners into enemies that must be conquered. The text described how this faction gained power, how they used the new technology of iron to create weapons that could harm even dragons, whose bodies, though powerful, were still vulnerable to physical damage when they took manifest form. There were battles, the manuscript revealed, not the glorious conflicts of legend where heroes slayed monsters, but tragic confrontations where former partners found themselves forced into opposition, where humans who had worked alongside dragons for generations were compelled by their new priests to hunt and kill the very beings who had taught them wisdom. "The dragons could have destroyed us," the Dragon Keeper wrote. "Their power was vast, and if they had chosen to use it without restraint, they could have reduced our cities to ash and our armies to scattered bones. But they did not, because they understood something that the new priest did not, that violence begets violence, that domination creates the very resistance it seeks to overcome, that the true path of evolution is not conquest, but integration. So they made a choice. They withdrew from the manifest world, pulling back into the energetic realms where they could continue their work of maintaining planetary balance without direct contact with humanity. And they left behind a prophecy." James's hands were shaking as he turned the page and saw the prophecy written in characters that seemed to glow with their own internal light. "When the earth herself cries out from the wounds inflicted by those who forgot the covenant, when the balance tips so far toward destruction that the continuation of life itself is threatened, when the dragons have been forgotten so completely that they exist only in stories told to children, then the covenant will be offered again. But this time, it will not be offered to all humanity. It will be offered only to those who can hear the call, who carry in their blood and bones the memory of the partnership, who dream of dragons not as monsters but as teachers, who understand in their depths that dominion is the death of the world and that partnership is the only path to continuation." The prophecy gave specific signs that would mark the time of offering. The Earth would show increasing signs of distress as human technology proceeded without wisdom to guide it, as extraction and exploitation pushed ecosystems toward collapse, as the climate itself became unstable from the interference with natural cycles. Ancient texts would be discovered revealing the truth about the dragons and the covenant, giving those who could see beyond the propaganda of the Dragon Slayer myths a glimpse of what had been lost. And most importantly, dragons would begin appearing in the dreams and visions of certain individuals, not as random symbols from the unconscious, but as actual contacts, the dragons reaching across the barrier between the energetic and physical realms to call their former partners back to remembrance and responsibility. James sat back from the manuscript, his mind reeling from the implications of what he had read. If this text was authentic, if it truly dated from the period it claimed, then everything he had been taught about the relationship between mythology and history was incomplete at best and deliberately false at worst. The dragons were not fantasy. They were not primitive attempts to explain natural phenomena. They were actual beings, consciousness that had evolved along a different trajectory than human consciousness. And the stories of dragons that appeared in every culture on Earth were not independent inventions, but fragmented memories of a time when the two forms of consciousness worked together in sacred partnership. He spent 7 days in the monastery, reading and rereading the manuscript, asking questions through gesture and receiving answers in the same silent language, gradually understanding that the monks who guarded this place were themselves practitioners of dragon consciousness, humans who had dedicated their lives to maintaining the techniques of energy perception and planetary healing that the original Dragon Keepers had developed. They showed him practices, taught him the first steps of the dragon dance, helped him begin to perceive the luminous web that connected all things, and on the final night, they brought him to the monastery's highest chamber, a room open to the sky where the stars blazed with an intensity that made them seem close enough to touch. There, in that chamber beneath the infinite sky, James had an experience that transcended anything his rational mind could categorize or explain. The air around him began to shimmer with the same quality of light he had seen in the crystal stand that held the manuscript. And then the light coalesced into a form that was simultaneously serpent and bird, lion and eagle, a being that incorporated multiple animal forms into a single coherent presence that radiated intelligence and compassion in equal measure. He knew without being told that he was in the presence of a dragon, not in physical form, but in what the manuscript had called energetic manifestation, consciousness making itself perceptible to human awareness. The dragon spoke to him, though its mouth did not move, and no sound disturbed the profound silence of the mountain night. You have read the testimony of the last dragon keeper, and you understand now that the stories your culture tells about us are lies designed to justify the breaking of the covenant. We did not leave because we were defeated. We withdrew because continuing to engage with humans who saw us as enemies would have required us to become the monsters they imagined, and we refused that transformation. But we have never stopped our work. We have continued to maintain the planetary balance from the energetic realms, doing what we can to prevent the worst consequences of human ignorance and arrogance. And now, as the prophecy foretold, we are calling certain humans back to partnership, offering the covenant again to those who can receive it without the need to dominate or control. True, the dragon showed him visions of the earth as it appeared from the perspective of energetic sight, and James wept at the beauty and the damage he perceived simultaneously. The web of life still glowed with intricate patterns of connection, each species linked to every other species in networks of mutual dependence and support. But there were tears in the web, places where human activity had disrupted the pattern so severely that whole sections of the network were collapsing, taking with them the creatures and plants and microorganisms that depended on those sections for sustenance and stability. He saw the climate systems destabilizing, feedback loops amplifying beyond the Earth's capacity to self-regulate, and he understood with terrible clarity that humanity had perhaps 3 or 4 decades at most before the damage became irreversible. But it is not too late, the dragon assured him. If enough humans remember the covenant, if enough choose partnership over dominion, if enough learn to work with the energy flows rather than against them, the balance can be restored. Not easily, not quickly, but it is still possible. You are being called to be one of the new dragon keepers, to learn the practices and to teach them to others who carry the memory in their blood, to help establish communities that work in conscious cooperation with the dragons and with the earth herself. Will you accept this calling? James understood that this was not a request, but an offer, and that he was free to refuse it, to return to his academic career and his comfortable life, to dismiss what he had experienced as hallucination or spiritual delusion. But he also understood that if he refused, if he chose the safety of the known over the risk of the calling, he would spend the rest of his life haunted by the memory of what he had glimpsed in that mountain chamber. The vision of what could be if humans remembered their true relationship with the living earth and the conscious beings who had partnered with them in ages past. He accepted, and in the moment of acceptance, he felt something shift in the very fabric of his being, as though a door that had been locked since birth suddenly opened and energies that had been dormant began to flow. The dragon touched him, or perhaps more accurately, touched the energetic field that surrounded and interpenetrated his physical body, and he felt knowledge downloading directly into his consciousness, bypassing verbal instruction and conceptual understanding, planting itself as seeds that would grow into capabilities he could not yet imagine. He returned from the monastery transformed, though the transformation had no obvious external evidence. He looked the same, spoke the same language, retained his academic credentials and his professional identity. But internally, everything had changed. He could see the energy flows now, perceive the luminous web that connected all things, feel the presence of the dragons working in the energetic realms to maintain what balance they could in the face of human destructiveness. And he began to gather others, finding those who had also been called in dreams, who had also encountered dragons in visions, who carried the genetic memory of the covenant and were ready to remember what their ancestors had known. They established centers in remote locations, places where the energy was still relatively clean and the connection to the earth was strong, and they began to practice the arts of the dragon keepers, learning to perceive and work with the flows of life force, to communicate with the consciousness of place and the beings who inhabited both physical and energetic realms. They created new forms of agriculture that worked with the land's natural patterns rather than imposing artificial designs. They developed architectural principles based on energy flow rather than just structural engineering. They pioneered economic models that valued ecosystem health as much as human profit. And slowly, quietly, without fanfare or announcement, the covenant began to be restored, not as a single global agreement, but as thousands of individual and community choices, humans in many places choosing partnership over dominion, cooperation over conquest, sacred relationship with the earth over exploitation of resources. The dragons responded, becoming more active, more present, more willing to work directly with humans who approached them with respect rather than the intent to dominate. The manuscript remains in the monastery, guarded by the silent monks who have preserved it through centuries of forgetting. The dragons remain primarily in the energetic realms, working to maintain planetary balance and calling to those who can hear their voices across the barrier between worlds. And the covenant, though broken, is being rebuilt piece by piece, relationship by relationship, choice by choice, as those who remember rise to meet those who never forgot, as the new dragon keepers learn the old arts and create new applications, as humanity, slowly, painfully, begins to understand that we were never meant to rule the earth alone, but to serve as conscious partners with intelligences that see what we cannot see, know what we have forgotten, and offer what we desperately need: the wisdom to live in balance, the humility to accept partnership, and the courage to transform domination into sacred cooperation before the last chance for restoration passes. And the earth herself must restore the balance through means that will not be gentle to those who broke the covenant and forgot that dragons were never the enemy, but always the teachers, waiting for students willing to learn. And if you like this story, you will definitely love the next one that's appearing on your screen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, leave your like and activate the notifications. See you in the next one.